Welcome to Vision on TV. We're here in London at the Rebellious Media Conference. I'm Kayte Fairfax and I'm speaking today with someone who doesn't require a great deal of introduction, John Pilger. Welcome. Thank you for speaking to us. You've recently completed a documentary, The War You Don't See, last year. And today you've just come from a War in the Media session. Quite a few interesting things were said there, so I'd like to ask you a question straight off. Your colleague in the session, Mark Curtis, was saying that media has a very major role to play in spreading disinformation and deception. Could you just say a little bit about how that happens?
It happens mainly because the media say they report wars, but in fact they promote wars. It's almost a role. It's not a sinister. It's sinister for us watching it, but that's their job in a sense, as an extension of media. The media isn't independent of great power. It isn't independent of governments in free societies. It's an extension of it. So when the elite in free societies, so-called free societies, is challenged, the media comes to its aid. So the challenge being a war, particularly an unpopular war. So the media's role is really beating the drums of that war, giving it a certain legitimacy.
How do you think those drums are beaten? Because in your session you specifically mentioned the role of journalists and you referred to embedded journalists.
By leaving things out.
Omissions?
Omission, censorship by omission. It's the most virulent form of censorship. By, for instance, we now have the invasion, occupation, whatever you want to call it, of Libya. And I mentioned that today a city near Tripoli, Sirte, is being bombed around the clock by NATO using fragmentation bombs and Hellfire missiles and so on. There is virtually no sense, we have virtually no sense of what that city is going through, in the same way that we had no sense of, say, how people suffered in the city of Fallujah in Iraq. We have no sense, really, of how people in village after village in Afghanistan suffer when they're attacked at night. So what I'm saying is that we get no understanding from the media of the sheer scale of civilian suffering, and civilians are in effect the enemy in a modern war.
Yeah, you talked about the scale of it as being the story of modern war that is not told.
Yeah, it's the scale of civilian suffering. I mean, in the First World War, the great majority were soldiers. They blew each other to bits. The Second World War, it came down. Vietnam, civilian deaths became when the majority of casualties were civilians. After that, Iraq, something like 90%. In Afghanistan, the majority. So these are wars against civilians. Now, yes, we get stories of individual civilian suffering and casualties, but they're seen as blunders and mistakes and isolated. We rarely get a sense, for example, in Iraq, if you take the John Hopkins survey of civilian casualties, that now equals, if not passes, the number of deaths, the Fordham University estimate of the deaths in Rwanda. So more than 1 million people. We understand that a terrible thing happened in Rwanda, but in understanding what we did in Iraq, we have no sense of that.
And you were also discussing when journalists actually take a role to promote or amplify deception rather than interrogating it. You gave an example from the US.
Yes. In my film, I interviewed Dan Rather, who is the most famous anchor for many years, CBS anchor, CBS News. And he said that, in his view, that had journalists in the United States, where the media is especially powerful because it enjoys this huge freedom, constitutional freedom, had they done their job, had they challenged and investigated and exposed the lies that led up to the invasion of Iraq instead of amplifying and echoing them, then in his view, that invasion would not have happened.
So what about the idea that journalists are complicit in war crimes? Is that your view?
Well, that's what he's saying. That's the implication of what he said. And in my film, there's David Rose of The Observer, who was responsible for some of the most impressive disinformation. And Rose said that he was lied to. The Observer published a lot of material from Rose, given to him through CIA-inspired sources, that there were weapons of mass destruction, and there were not. Rose now says that it's this kind of journalism that does qualify journalists to have blood on their hands. Yes.
Should they be prosecuted?
I don't know about. Yes, of course. Crimes are crimes. They should be prosecuted. But there is no mechanism for prosecuting. We don't prosecute Westerners unless they're Milosevic and one or two official demons. We prosecute mainly, yes, we prosecute people from the Balkans, or we prosecute people from Africa. But the greatest war criminals, of course, are within our own midst, our own leaders. Just in the sheer numbers of people that have been killed or have suffered or have been dispossessed by the actions of people like Blair.
Thinking about documentary in general, it's becoming easier to make and it's becoming more popular as a form for general viewing. Do you think that that's diluting its impact or increasing its impact as a form of radical media?
I don't think, I mean, there are some very interesting documentaries around, but documentaries in holding up a mirror to our societies in terms of the wars that Western societies, Western governments start and wage, and that's highly unusual. So, as we're speaking about war, I would say the number of documentaries that really analyse war from a truthful basis are very, very few. Yes. Very few. This is a great shame because there are good documentary makers, and the documentary is probably the most vibrant, informative device for most people. It's a visual essay. It helps them make sense of the news, helps them make sense of the world. They have a right to know about perhaps the great unsaid, the great unmentionable, that we in powerful countries, in Britain and particularly the United States, are responsible for mayhem and suffering throughout the world as part of policy.
What about your own documentaries? How have the communities that you've portrayed and you've given voice to, how have they reacted to your films?
Well, say if you take the Chagos Islanders, I made a film called Stealing a Nation, which was about the expulsion of the people of the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia and others, by the British in the 1960s, so that the Americans could build a base there. That film has been used relentlessly by the community, the same with Death of a Nation, which was about East Timor. That was taken to the United Nations and all over the world by the Timorese. I didn't realize at first. I've always made my films for most people, so that to give most people a sense of what I'm trying to say in those documentaries. But in recent years I have become aware that the documentaries are also being made for the communities that I'm filming as well.
Just on WikiLeaks, you mentioned today, it's causing panic to mainstream media. Why is that?
Well, it's blowing a whistle. It's bypassing the gatekeepers, and it's shaming so much of mainstream journalism, which most of it takes power, great power, at its word, at face value. WikiLeaks shows us how power thinks, how it what it says, the truth the truth it speaks in private, and the lies it tells in public.
Yeah.
So it's a very straightforward form of journalism.
Roger, we need to evac this child. She's got a wound to the belly. Hey, I need to get the brass to drop ramps. I got a wounded girl. We need to take the rest of Maya.
Oh, it's their fault for bringing their kids to a battle. That's right.
And that's why it's upset so much of the mainstream media. It's shaming.
As have you. Thank you so much, John Pilger. It's been a privilege. You've been watching Vision on TV. Thank you very much. See you next time.